behalf of Campbell & Company, I'd like to welcome you to Relationship Management Introduction using Campbell & Company's Strategic Information Services. This is the first of our 2014-2015 webinar series. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to Campbell & Company webinars. So first, to ensure that you have the best webinar experience possible, please follow these quick tips to close any programs other than GoToWebinars, of course, that are running on your computer. Call in using a telephone instead of using your computer speakers or your cell phone. Move away your cell phone away from your computer. And finally, if you experience any visual issues, send a chat to Campbell & Company or contact GoTo at 1-800-263-6317. Finally, today's webinar will last 60 minutes and you will earn 1 continuing education credit, and that is good for certification with CFRE International. And about an hour after the webinar, you'll receive an email that will include a web address and directions on how to receive your certificate and the PDF of the presentation. We welcome questions during the webinar, so if you have any, please send a chat to Campbell & Company and I will ask them throughout. And now I'd like to take a moment to introduce Carrie Dahlquist and Mark Seiler. Carrie Dahlquist is the Director of Strategic Information Services at Campbell & Company. She helps organizations understand how complex information can impact the big picture and inform the decision-making process. She works with institutions to develop a roadmap that is manageable and measurable. Carrie holds a Master of Business Administration from the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business with concentrations in econometrics and strategy. Mark Seiler is Associate Consultant here at Campbell & Company, and prior to Campbell & Company, he worked with the Annual Giving Programs team at the University of Notre Dame, where he managed and operated the Development Phone Center and oversaw the class gifts campaigns for the Reunion Giving Program. He is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Theology and a certificate from the Business Operations Leadership Institute. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Carrie and Mark.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. We're very pleased to have the opportunity to speak today about the importance of relationship management and our approach at Campbell & Company to it. Just want to acknowledge that we have some goals for our time today. First, we want to talk about relationship management in general, what it is and what are the benefits and challenges to undertaking this important endeavor. We want to talk a little bit about what it takes to identify the right prospects, and then when you identify them, what it is that you're supposed to do with them to manage them effectively. And that really is dependent on developing an effective process. And we're going to talk a little bit about our approach to developing that process and to supporting it with really powerful metrics and reports that can help manage at an individual and institutional level. And then finally, we want to talk about the resources that are needed to do all of this efficiently and effectively. So I think when we first conceived this webinar, we talked about the fact that so many of our clients come to us with really 2 common scenarios. They're either looking to start out a major gift program or they're looking to take their current program to the next level. In either case, we work with them to take a look at where they are and to look at how relationship management can really help to acquire that next generation of major gifts. And how relationship management can really play a critical role. The benefits of relationship management and having an effective system are that this really gives us an opportunity to engage and involve our most important donors. As we've recently seen, Giving USA reconfirmed yet again that over 80% of philanthropic giving comes from individuals. And for us, that's a statistic that we've been quoting for a number of years, but really reinforces the importance of meeting these donors where they are and engaging them in a meaningful way. Because if we do that we really have the ability to impact our most important programs. And I think that gets us to that last bullet here, which is acknowledging that this can be a moment for an institution that's really transformational and not incremental. So many of our programs we manage by the percent increases, and they can be on the margins. And while that's important, and allows us to develop pipelines and programs long term, major gift and relationship management impact on major gift acquisition really gives us the opportunity to think transformationally, both for institutions, but also I think it's important to acknowledge that as gift officers and as individuals stewarding these gifts, that this is an opportunity for donors to be transformational as well. It allows us to engage with them in a way where they can have a really important and long-lasting impact on the organizations that are most important to them. So we just want to acknowledge up front that that this takes a commitment and that there are challenges in instituting a really effective major gift and relationship management system. First, this often requires a culture shift, in particular for those organizations that are looking to develop this for the first time. And it takes buy-in from staff leadership and volunteers. It takes making sure that you've got the set of resources that are going to allow you to really invest in that, and acknowledging up front that it doesn't happen overnight. This can be time-consuming and requires discipline and an investment of resources up front. But we think it's well worth it. And so we're going to spend our time today talking first and foremost about what it takes to manage individual relationships kind of at a micro level, and then move into what it takes to manage those relationships across an entire system.
Thanks, Carrie, and thanks, Sarah. So as we go to the next slide, you'll see our graphic that we use often with our current clients to illustrate relationship management. And here's where I want to be very clear and very cognizant that we understand that most of you, if not all of you, have seen a graphic like this or some iteration of it. And also be clear that we understand that our terminology at Campbell and Company can differ slightly from those institutions on this call. So ultimately, we just wanted to illustrate at a very high level what we sort of maintain as our standard for the relationship management pipeline and then cycle. And what we'll drill into is sort of what we view as the three main steps in driving this cycle and driving prospects and future prospects through the cycle. Sarah? So in the first main step, we want to focus on identifying those people who have high capacity as prospects. In other words, of course, we want to spend our time with those people who have the ability, the good fortune to make a major gift. And again, this is a term that we realize can differ vastly among the participants on this call. A major gift for your institution could be $1,000, or it could be $100,000. Ultimately, we will still focus on the fundamentals of identifying those high-capacity prospects. So ultimately, the first step, you want to look within your current database. You can do work in-house. You can conduct an RFM scoring. That's an acronym for recency, frequency, and monetary scoring, to give yourself a better idea of how, for lack of better terminology, how close someone is to your institution based on their philanthropic giving. You could conduct peer screening exercises of board members or auxiliary board members, or just of really active volunteers who have great knowledge of your constituencies and the community, to talk about who the high capacity prospects are that maybe your institution is not necessarily thinking of immediately. If it is too cumbersome to conduct in-house, you could potentially engage a vendor to conduct exercises like data appends, electronic screenings, or predictive modeling. This is where the sort of data wonk in me comes out, and we start to talk about electronic screenings and gathering hard wealth assets of those people in our database, or predictive modeling, which will score people to suggest to you who could or maybe even should be giving to you at a major gift level. And then ultimately, we can work with you to help you to vet and verify results that come from these exercises, to then that will precipitate into what we refer to as a capacity analysis. And ultimately, what do we mean by capacity analysis? Well, there are two main goals of an exercise like this, At a very high level, we want to take a look at the full picture, the aggregate capacity of your database. And then at a much more granular level, we want to separate who are the top prospects. In other words, who are people you might go to tomorrow or even next week, whether it's in the life of a campaign or in the life of a perpetual major gift program, to solicit for a major gift or a campaign gift, and who are the people who are future prospects. In other words, who are those people might it take 5 or 6 or 7 substantive interactions with before you're in a position to approach them for a major gift level support to your institution. And a capacity analysis, frankly, can be done in-house, or we can be helpful with that exercise as well. If you come to a point where you've identified your prospects and your future prospects, and you juxtapose them with a gift table, whether that's a gift table for fiscal year 15 or it's a gift table for your campaign, and you have found a gap that exists between the number of qualified prospects needed to fill that gift level versus qualified prospects identified, then you might need to look outside your current database. And this is an area in which Campbell & Company can be helpful as well. It is what we refer to as a proactive prospect identification process. And I'm going to ESPN SportsCenter you guys here a second and say, at an upcoming webinar, we'll talk more about our prospect research services. But I apologize because we won't do that today. So you'll have to stay tuned for our next webinar. Ultimately, once you have identified those other prospects outside of your database in a more proactive fashion, then we would suggest that you take another look at your capacity analysis, and once you've recalibrated a gift table, then you can refresh that capacity analysis and begin to sort of launch your program from there. So that is a bit of a complex step.
Mark, we did receive a question from the audience regarding RFM and what that means.
Okay. Again, so RFM is an acronym for recency, frequency, and monetary. And ultimately, what you're doing is you're taking into account how recently someone gave to the institution, at what frequency. So have they given each year over the past 3 or 5 or even 10 years? And the monetary points to at what level are they giving to you? Are they already giving to you at a major gift level? Are they perhaps, for lack of better terminology, they are underperforming? In other words, they might have greater capacity. And also, I think I'd like to turn to Carrie and see if she has any additions to make to this, because you heard her background, econometrics. So.
No, I think you described it perfectly. I think the goal of RFM, when we think about predictive modeling, as Mark talked about a moment ago, the goal is to score and to be able to prioritize who looks like your best prospects. So RFM is really, it's sort of a very basic kind of predictive modeling that you can do in-house. You can do it as Excel spreadsheets. You can do it with very, very simple formulas. And actually, we have some very basic directions on how to do it that we're happy to post after today's webinar, and we'll walk you through sort of step-by-step how you can do that effectively. So the goal is, you want to look for prospects in your database. We understand that you can start that exercise in-house using tools that you have, and you might find that you know enough at that moment to move to the next step. Great.
Thanks, Carrie. Beyond determining who has capacity, the next step we'd like to take is to focus on determining who, again, for lack of better terminology, likes us enough to support the institution at a major gift level. So we want to confirm that capacity that either data or a peer has identified as potentially existing, and then we want to determine their inclination. So we say, the first bullet here, we say assign relationship managers for qualification. We'll be very clear about, this is a term that we throw around at Campbell & Company often, but we'll be very clear about what we mean by it here. And again, we know that at your respective institutions, this could be a different vocabulary word than you normally use. When we refer to a relationship manager here, we mean that it's one person on staff who is effectively responsible for the movement of prospects through the relationship management cycle. In other words, they might not be the person who does the solicitation of that respective prospect or future prospect, but what it means is mechanically, they're responsible for making sure that person is qualified by someone as a gift officer. If they could potentially do it themselves, they also want to make sure that that they are taking advantage of cultivation opportunities, and then they might go so far as to schedule an actual solicitation for a prospect or a future prospect, for a prospect. And again, they might or they might not be engaged in the actual solicitation itself, but they are responsible for the movement of that person into the solicitation phase, and then and finally into the stewardship phase once the gift has been secured and the donor has committed, and then we are responsible as an institution for recognizing them appropriately. Within this process, you want to decide whether or not any preliminary prospect research is needed before contact. And again, we'll talk about prospect research on our next webinar or in a future webinar. At this point, we want to determine, is there sort of any high-level or brief information that you might need about this prospect or future prospect going into a meeting about them? We're not talking about a long 7 to 10 page research report where we're looking deep into their background and their familial connections. We're talking about maybe a 1 or a 2 pager that explains the high-level findings we have about them outside of what the data has already identified from a vendor or what a peer has identified. Then the next step is to make contact, and ultimately we always advise our clients that this contact should be face-to-face, because we all know that such a huge percentage of communication, real communication, is done through your body language. So phone qualification is great and can work, but ultimately getting into people's homes or their places of business and talking with them face-to-face is definitely preferable. And being transparent with them, explaining to them your purpose for why you're there, gleaning what motivates them as a donor, understanding things like what they would like to do with their philanthropic career at your respective institution are things that you should focus on. And ideally, when you leave that office or that home, we recommend that you have an idea beginning to formulate in your head of a target ask amount based on what you've learned about their capacity, if you've confirmed their capacity, and what you've learned about whether or not our institution is high enough on their list of philanthropic priorities to support in a major way. Then the last bullet point is about qualifying or disqualifying, and ultimately I think disqualifying perhaps doesn't get paid enough attention to, and it's an important step, because whether you're disqualifying someone in the life of a campaign or you're disqualifying someone in the life of a perpetual major gift program, it still will create for you a pool of people that you can go back and review, whether it's near the end of a campaign in perhaps the public phase, or it's several years down the road in a perpetual major gift program. And what it allows for you to do is to review it either internally or externally, and then reevaluate whether it might make sense to go back to those people, because perhaps either you were not able to confirm their capacity or their inclination wasn't in the right place at this current time. So you might be able to determine that those things have changed later. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, Karen.
I'd just like to add one more thing to that, because I think sometimes, as a gift officer, we sometimes don't want to acknowledge that it feels like failure if you disqualify somebody. And I think it's really important for systems, for managers, and institutions to understand that this is a really, really valuable part of the process, because if you can determine at this early stage that it doesn't appear that somebody is ready or inclined for whatever reason to engage at a higher level right now, that it really helps you focus your resources. I mean, as you're about to get into the next steps, which are, the most important and really help us advance the relationship towards solicitation. And if you see indicators early on that somebody's just not ready to take that next step, the best thing that an officer can do is to acknowledge that up front and let's realign those resources in support of somebody who may be willing to take that next step. So I think sometimes we're afraid to disqualify people, and as managers we need to model for our staff that, you know, whether somebody is disqualified or qualified, getting out and doing those qualifications in business is what's important, and working through that prospect pool to get to a set of viable prospects.
Thank you, Carrie. In step 3, we'll start the engagement and movement towards securing a major gift. So our goal here is to develop, track, and ultimately execute very specific, disciplined individual strategies to help people move through that relationship management cycle that we reviewed a few slides ago, through the cultivation, the solicitation, and the stewardship phases. And so what we want to focus on is developing and refining strategies, ultimately at 2 different levels. So you have at the engagement level, at a very broad level, you want to take into account what you gleaned from your qualification visit about what their interests are. Again, what they might want to accomplish in their philanthropic career with the institution, and apply those to a strategy to engage them, whether that means inviting them to events or getting them to meet with executive leadership, or potentially an influential faculty or staff member, or even engage them with other volunteers in your institution who are really active and really passionate about the same types of things. And then, again, at a much more granular level, in developing a solicitation strategy, you want to take a look at very specifically at the mechanics that are involved in the actual solicitation. So elements like specific information about the target ask date and amount, the key players who will be involved in the solicitation, and then the major sort of pillar action steps that are associated with getting to the meeting. The meeting in which you're saying, we need you to support our institution at the $1 million level. As a part of defining those strategies, again, we've talked, so the previous slide, we discussed assigning a relationship manager to qualify the person. In this case, oftentimes the relationship manager who is assigned to qualify someone will remain the relationship manager for the rest of the process, but there are several reasons for which a relationship manager could be changed. Among them might be geographic region of the country, or if they are qualified and determined to be an extraordinarily high urgency prospect, they might be assigned immediately to the president and or CEO of the organization, in which case the relationship manager might change. Natural partners are those people, we view natural partners as those people who are a lot of times volunteers, but they could also be, again, an influential faculty or staff member, or potentially a physician at a healthcare organization. So we want to think about those people who, again, maybe they share interests with our prospects or future prospects, and could be influential in moving that relationship forward with those prospects or future prospects. And then we'd like to purposefully move the prospect through the pipeline. And this is a point at which you might determine as an institution that additional prospect research may be needed. And I mentioned earlier a much longer version of a prospect research report that really delves into someone's personal background or digs deeper into someone's hard wealth assets that were identified by an electronic screening exercise. And then the last bullet, we wanted to be, it's terribly obvious, but we wanted to be extremely transparent. We want to be extremely clear about actually making the ask, being very mechanical and very methodical and very deliberate about asking the prospect. I actually don't like to refer to it as the ask because it's super impersonal. I think it sort of takes the art of fundraising out of it. But again, we wanted to sort of be loudly obvious here in this last bullet, hence the 2 exclamation points. So in my work with clients, I see often directors of development or presidents can get caught sort of in that cycle of cultivation. So we wanted to call to attention the necessary mechanics of asking prospects for a major gift. So I end up having a great deal of very deliberate conversations with my clients about about solicitation strategy. So again, if you go up to that first bullet, the second bullet within develop and refine strategies. So the elements are who will be in the room, and what are we going to ask them for, so what purpose and what dollar amount, and then who will actually say the words, we need your support at the $1 million level. So as we sort of pull away from the granular focus on managing a prospect through the relationship management cycle, I'll hand it back over to Carrie to talk about taking this one very specific instance of managing a relationship with one person and put that into the context of a much broader process and full portfolio or set of portfolios.
Right. Thanks, Mark. Yeah. So we've talked about the already taxing work of sort of one frontline officer and what they need to do to manage a portfolio effectively and move their prospects through the pipeline. Now we wanted to kind of come up a level and talk about, what does it take to manage multiple portfolios or an entire prospect pool with that many moving parts. And you can see how it becomes very complex very quickly. So we want to talk with you about how you manage a system for the entire pool and how you do it effectively with limited bandwidth and competing interests, as so many of us have in our organizations. I think the first step is just understanding how important clarity is in relationship management. And Mark talked a little bit about some of these roles, but I think acknowledging the various people that are going to play significant roles in relationship management within your organization is really, really important. So who are the lists of discrete relationship managers? Who are the universe of natural partners that you have access to? And really, we've talked a little bit about prospect research and the importance that it can play, whether you have the function in-house or you need to outsource it. But acknowledging that you have a function that you need to identify earlier in the process is really, really important. And I think, too, determining who's going to be ultimately responsible for the process. Sometimes it's a DOD, sometimes it's a prospect researcher, sometimes it's a collaboration between those two positions, but understanding who's going to be responsible for managing the individual relationships and who's going to be responsible for managing the process is really, really important. Developing guidelines for a lot of things, but in particular around portfolio size. We get a lot of questions from our clients about what is the right size portfolio. And I think, unfortunately, there is no easy answer. We spend a lot of time trying to understand with our clients the universe of roles and different hats that people in their shops may wear. And so, we can talk about what it looks like for a full-time equivalent major gift officer and what a portfolio size looks like for that individual. But I think, wrapping your head around how much time your frontline officers really have to dedicate to being on the road and being in front of people is really, really important. And then determining based on that how large their portfolio should be. That is really critical. So if a full-time gift officer is 150 prospects, for example, and you've got somebody who has management responsibilities and is helping to set up events, for example, you need to be realistic about how many people they're going to be able to see in a given year and adjust the portfolio accordingly. We also get a lot of questions about prospect status or stage, as some people call it. How long is it reasonable to expect that a prospect should stay in qualification or cultivation? And so we are more and more encouraging our clients to set up guidelines for that. For example, we often talk about trying to move a prospect from qualification to cultivation within 90 days of them being identified, just to kind of keep that process going and keep the pipeline moving and focus on that movement and moving people from one stage to the next. So we're establishing guidelines around each stage with our clients and what's an appropriate amount of time. Understanding that not each prospect will fit nicely in the guidelines, and there are perfect reasons why somebody may not have been qualified outside of 90 days. Maybe you haven't made it to the region yet. Maybe there's a perfect opportunity coming up that you're already aware of, or maybe they've just fallen off the radar. All of those are legitimate answers that we hear a lot of the time, but this is a mechanism by which you kind of stay on top of the portfolios. We're highly in favor of business rules, so we're going to talk for a moment about the importance of goal setting and reports. And so really, I think determining what your system can track and what's important to you as a management team to track is really, really critical. And then figuring out how specifically in your system you can track that. We spend a lot of time with our clients helping them think through metrics, and oftentimes what we find is that before we get in and are able to have the conversation, perhaps they're developing reports on their own and they're exporting them out of the system and they're manually manipulating them, and that's that takes a lot of time and introduces a lot of human error. So I think understanding upfront what your system can track and developing business rules around that in an appropriate way is really important. And then just wanted to acknowledge that this is all stuff that you can do in-house, but if not, we've got a lot of expertise around helping to set up this process. And as I mentioned just a moment ago, we talk a lot about setting goals and measuring progress to them. And I think oftentimes we put all of this investment up front into developing these portfolios and training our gift officers and reinforcing the need to track information in a meaningful way. And then all too often we forget or just get tired at this point in the process where we actually have to set the goals and really measure our progress toward them. So in setting goals, we mentioned at the outset of this of our time today that sometimes when we're talking about relationship management and developing major gift programs, that we're asking organizations for a culture shift. And I think if you think that that is appropriate for the organization that you're sitting in right now, that when you talk about setting goals, it's really important to communicate effectively, to talk about why we're doing this, how we see it being able to help us evolve to the next level, and talk about what the benefits are. We want to make sure that when we set goals, that we're talking about both leading and lagging indicators. This is something we spend a lot of time talking about. And really what it underscores is that you want to be focused on both inputs and outputs. All too often, we're completely focused on dollars raised, for example. But you can't really measure those until sort of the end of the fiscal year. And by then, it's really too late to kind of impact them. So, we know that there's a correlation between getting out in front of people and sitting down face-to-face and having those visits and really putting yourself in a position to ask for the dollars. So tracking visits, is just as important as tracking the dollars raised. It's really important to establish a baseline. So when you're just introducing the idea of metrics or performance measurement, acknowledging with your staff that you're going to kind of take it for a dry run, make sure that you can track effectively in the system, and that I think this gives you an opportunity to get buy-in and allow your officers to see that this is a good thing for them, being able to see their performance and roll it up in a way that can be summarized effectively can be really, really empowering for individual officers. And it's not something that they need to be sort of afraid of, but they should see it as an empowering opportunity. Again, just being transparent. Why are we doing this? What are we hoping we'll accomplish in the organization's evolution? How do we see this taking us to the next level? And then making sure that you're reviewing goals and progress to them on a regular basis. I think all too often, we spend one time a year in advance of our upcoming fiscal year putting all of these plans together, setting all of these goals, and then we frankly don't often look at them again until we're nearing the end of the fiscal year. So I think we're always trying to reinforce with our clients the need to review these goals and our progress to them on a regular basis, and that underscores the importance of both the reports and the relationship management meetings. I think having automated reports is really, really critical. All too often, we're asking our officers to try to sort of summarize their activity as we come together, and we're spending a lot of time having them just try to capture what they've been doing anecdotally over the course of the last month or so, and really having a very clear set of automated reports that somebody can access in the system on their own, so they can see sort of where they are, where they're tracking to their own individual goals, where the team is, and where ultimately the organization is really, really important. We've personally developed a lot of in-house capacity around this, and we're finding that some people have the capacity in-house, and that's fantastic, but for those that don't, it's really important to work with a partner who can help you get over the hump and working with your, the nuances of your own particular system to get to that set of reports, because it really does enable the rest of the system to move efficiently. And then finally, bringing it all together with dedicated relationship management meetings where you have an opportunity to look at those reports and review progress and review goals, review your progress to goals. This gives you an audit mechanism. So we talked a little bit about guidelines before and setting guidelines around stages. So having an opportunity to come together on a regular basis, whether it's once a month or twice a month, to look at those prospects who are in qualification, or to look at those who are in cultivation or getting close to solicitation, and to look at those who have frankly been lingering in those stages can be really, really important. Thinking through what resources we need to bring to bear, in particular as people advance through the pipeline, is really, really important. And then ultimately, I've been really impressed when you do all of this effectively, when you've set goals, when you've gotten the reports, when you can clearly see your progress toward goal, how much time opens up in relationship management meetings to be able to discuss challenges and celebrate successes. And I think for me, having been a relationship manager, this is the really, really fun part. And this is where we ask our officers to put a lot of time in tracking information. We put a lot of time into asking our officers to track information in appropriate ways, and sometimes it can seem a little overwhelming, but this part, when we get to the point where we've got relationship management meetings and we're reviewing our progress and looking at reports and have the time to be able to talk through what we're experiencing in the field and lean on our colleagues to help us think through challenges, I think that's where the system all comes together in a really effective way. So what's next? We've talked a little bit about some of the resources that you need to accomplish this. I think at a high level, the first step is to just take an inventory, figure out what you have within your organizations, what kind of bandwidth and capacity do you have in-house, both at the prospect research function, who do you have that will be on the front line, and what kind of resources do you have in the management position, and what kind of reports that team is going to need to be able to really manage this effectively. And I think following that, how functional and accessible is your database? Some systems are, really, really nimble and really flexible and support relationship management in a really effective way, and some just weren't necessarily built for it, and you need to think through how to enable your system to track this. And that absolutely has an impact on what you can track and what you're ultimately going to be able to report on. So sort of knowing what you're starting with in terms of your database is really important. And then I think, based on all of that, based on the resources that you have and the pool that you have and the tools that you have, being realistic about what can be accomplished. I think setting goals is really important. Setting aggressive goals is really important, but also being realistic about dollar amounts and timelines is equally important. And then acknowledging that, to the extent that you can't accomplish this all in-house, you need to figure out a plan for how you'll get extra help where needed. Because once you commit to relationship management, you really have to keep it going. Once donors and prospects get used to being engaged with in a particular way, you don't want to lose momentum. And once you've invested the time and energy into getting this kind of system up and running, you really want to make sure that you're supporting it effectively moving forward. So finally, as I mentioned, a lot of what we've talked about today can be accomplished in-house. Some of our clients have larger shops that can do a lot of this, and some of our clients really need help thinking through, what they can do in-house and where they might need some additional support. So we've gotten a quick recap of our services here, and we're happy to talk through them with you, one-off, and you can certainly email us if you have questions about any of these. But I think the goal is, however you get there, whether it's through your own shop or with help, it's complicated to identify the right prospects, to move them into the cycle, to keep that cycle going, and then to manage it effectively, both from a manager's standpoint in terms of how do you build the business rules to support that process, but also how do you get the reports in place to be able to keep track of it effectively. And I think with that, we want to open it up to any questions.
Sure. We did receive a question in terms of recommendations for doing RFM in-house.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, an RFM scoring is it's very simple. Really all you need is information about a constituent's last, sort of frequency of giving, their last giving date, and their total giving, all of which should be relatively easily accessible from your system. It can all be done in an Excel spreadsheet, and it's very easy then to be able to score prospects and help prioritize them. So I'm happy to post our resources on how to do that, and I think it's, at the very least, I think it's a really good first step to be able to see, what kind of prospects you have and how you might want to be able to engage them.
Great, thank you, Carrie. I have a question from the audience member saying what would be included in the Relationship Management Handbook?
So our approach to relationship management and the handbook is really, for us, it's sort of a three-part process. The step one is really a kind of a general introduction to relationship management, the various stages, the roles, the cycle, not unlike what we've talked about very briefly here today. And then step two really focuses on specifically, with using your particular system, whether that's Razor's Edge or Team Approach or Senior Systems or Tessitura, or there are Salesforce, there are so many of them out there. Whether, how do you specifically use your system to track key information? So where are you going to put a prospect status? Where are you going to track relationship managers? And where are you going to track critical information about proposals, for example? And then, making sure, again, that it's all accessible for reporting purposes, which is really sort of the third phase, is helping you set up sample reports in your system.
What do you, so we have another question from the audience. What do you recommend in terms of stages for planned gift asks? And then how do you define that cycle or to modify the major gift stages to fit planned giving asks?
It's a really good question. So yeah. I think we tend to think about major and planned gift as very connected. We think about major gifts, we're asking people to make a serious commitment to the organization, and I think in planned gifts we're oftentimes asking them to make their ultimate commitment to the organization. So most oftentimes your best major gift prospects can also be great planned giving prospects, although not necessarily vice versa. So I think being aware of those prospects who may not be great major gift prospects, but who could be really viable planned giving prospects is really important. And then I think you can manage those relationships in a very similar way in terms of cultivating them, figuring out what motivates them, making sure that you get the proper documentation, and continuing to steward them once that documentation has been received. I think for those who are in the major gift cycle who happen to be planned gift prospects, you're probably going to go back to them perhaps a number of times. So just being aware of when you're asking, making sure that your timing is right in terms of when you're focused on the planned gift and when you're focused on the major gift. And sometimes, frankly, those can come together. But I think we're huge proponents at Campbell & Company about the importance of talking about not only planned giving, but annual giving as well, and how all of those pieces play into the major gift cycle and can be really valuable cultivation opportunities.
Great. We have another question from the audience in terms of what vendor might we use for screening/modeling, and how would that play into a capacity analysis?
Great question. I think that there are a lot of different. Mark, do you want to take this?
Sure. I'd be happy to. Thank you. There are, as Carrie was saying, there are a number of different vendors out there who will perform exercises like we talked about earlier in the identification phase. Specifically at Campbell & Company, we are strategic partners with Blackbaud. And so often we find we are advising our clients to use target analytics as the vendor to perform an electronic screening or modeling exercise. That is not to say that we will not advise them to use another vendor if it is appropriate for that respective client. Obviously, our focus is on our clients and is on the proper fiscal management at our clients, and also we want to position our clients in the best way to use the information that they get back in an effective and efficient manner. And in some cases, it's possible that vendors will provide too much information or information that is perhaps too nuanced. And so we want to put our clients in a position to best use the data that's coming from the respective vendors. How might that play into a capacity analysis? Again, the two goals of our capacity analysis are to look at the aggregate of the capacity of the whole database, or at least of all those records that are screened and or modeled. So what we want to do is try to determine what might be that pool of philanthropic dollars that each individual in the database has to contribute to their respective lists of philanthropic priorities. And so we use several pieces of data to come up with a number. And so we use the screening information, we use the modeling information, and then ultimately also we mentioned on a more granular level, the second goal of the capacity analysis is to drive at a separated prioritized list, two lists of people who appear, according to the data, to be prospects today or next week, and then a prioritized list of people who appear to be future prospects. In other words, those people who are not as close to our organization as we hope they might be one day, and prioritize those people to determine who we might start to engage now for a period of 6 to 12 to 18, maybe even 24 months from now, based on how distant they might be from our organization, how many substantive interactions we might need to have with them, how many events they might need to come to, or how many interactions they might need to have with the president or a dean, and determine in their respective engagement plan how far are they from the point where we can go to them and say, we need your help in a big way.
Great. I also had, I think one of you mentioned the term or the phrase philanthropic career, and so there's just a question in terms of what that phrase refers to.
Sure. So we want to, again, this is a donor-centric process, right? We haven't used that term yet either, but we want to advise our clients to focus on each individual prospect and or future prospect as just that, an individual. And so we want to make sure that we're paying, particularly in the phases of qualification and cultivation, we want to make sure we're paying particular attention to what they're interested in at our institution and what their motivations are as a person, and ultimately what they'd like to take their philanthropic dollars, what they've been blessed with, frankly, to earn and to have, what they want to accomplish at our respective organization with those dollars. And beyond that, what they might want to show their progeny, what they might want to show their family about the impact that they can make, whether it's at our institution or at another institution of their own choosing, in their respective lives. So I think that's, we've talked a lot about sort of for lack of better terminology, I don't like to use cliches, we've talked a lot about the science of fundraising today, right? We've talked a lot about data and goals, and to me, a philanthropic career is sort of falls more on the side of the art of fundraising, right? Understanding what, as a human being, gets them going, what motivates them every day, and how might we, as a nonprofit organization, give them an opportunity to make an impact and leave a legacy that they want to leave. So that's what we're viewing as a philanthropic career.
Yeah, and I think it also underscores that these are long-term relationships, This is not, as we move from annual giving, for example, to major and planned giving, we are no longer talking about transactional. We are talking about long-term relationships that, as we mentioned at the outset, can really be transformational. So that idea of a career, I think, really reinforces the fact that these people are going to be engaged for some significant length of time.
Great. Thanks, guys. Another question regarding a staff person who is responsible for the relationship management process. What is an appropriate job title, and do you have any sample position descriptions for that function?
Well, I think, if I understand the question correctly, I think we tend to talk about that person as a relationship manager. I think they can be your frontline officers, they can be your major gift officers, and I think that I think probably the job description for any relationship manager or gift officer probably underscores a lot of the responsibilities that we're talking about here. I think when the nuance that we want to reinforce when it comes to relationship manager is that it is a singular. There is one single development person who is ultimately responsible for the relationship that a prospect has with an organization, and that is often and most likely going to be a major gift officer or development officer or whatever it is that your institution might choose to call that position. But we want to acknowledge that that ultimately there's one person that's going to be charged with shepherding for evolving and shepherding a strategy from sort of inception to execution and involving all the right players, whether those are external or internal players. So I don't think it's a different job description than a major gift officer or a gift officer that you would have at your organization. I think it's just reinforcing that there's only one person assigned to a particular prospect as a relationship manager. But I'm happy to provide some language around that responsibility.
Okay, great. Thanks, Carrie. And then one more, at least in terms of what we have right now. Do you have any tips for managing organizational cultural challenge around major gifts and balance the immediate needs with long-term focus and patience, and the patience it takes to build a high-performing program?
Well, that's a whole other webinar, I think. Actually, we do have a webinar coming up that's sort of related to that. I mean, I think that that's a fantastic question, and really is what we were getting at earlier, that you have to acknowledge up front that there are long-term benefits of adopting this kind of system, but they don't necessarily pay off overnight. And you're absolutely right. There are resource allocation issues here. So if you're going to invest, for example, in a major gift officer to really help establish or evolve a major gift program, it's going to take a while for that person to get in, to become familiar with the case, and to be comfortable talking about the message of an organization, and be able to then go out and begin to manage these relationships effectively. And if you think about how many events or how many direct response vehicles could I produce for that same amount of resources, I think that it's certainly a trade-off that you're going to ask your organization to make. But again, the goal is to be able to really take your fundraising program to the next level. I think oftentimes we see that there are perhaps board members or close top foundation prospects or corporate prospects who are sometimes willing to help organizations invest in organizational capacity. And so, if you think that this is something that you don't necessarily have the resources for right now, you might think through sort of who are the prospects that are already closest to your organization, and can you go to them and think about capacity building and this as a really important aspect of it. Because we're seeing more and more that prospects are finding this as a viable giving opportunity to really think through how they get their organizations focused on sustainability in the long term.
Great. And before everybody hangs up today, we do have another question, but I'm just going to just point you to the screen that our next relationship management webinar is scheduled for Thursday, October 30th at 12 p.m. Central Time. So Carrie will be back talking about finding the right prospects. I had one more question. They keep coming in, which is great, but did you say you could post your tool for RFM scoring?
Yes, we're happy to post it at the conclusion of today's webinar.
Great, we'll go ahead and make sure that's up online. So I think we're all set with questions. We had a number of them, which is great, but if you have any further questions, please feel free to email us. You can also email Carrie directly. It's carrie.dahlquist@campbellcompany.com. She'd be happy to answer any questions, and as well as Mark as well. So you can find their contact information on our site, or you can just give us a call. But otherwise, we look forward to seeing you in October. And if you have any questions, please give us a call. We hope that your fall is off to a great start. So thank you, everyone.